What's going on, guys? It's Ursus here. I'm bringing you another Thief build, this time updated for Daredevil as of the release of the expansion. And I've got to say, I am very impressed with Daredevil. It's versatile, it's fun, which is the most important part for me. It's just varied in the way it plays. It completely changes the way I do things in most modes. It's fantastic. So I've been very happy with it so far, and thankfully it's at least part of the enhanced damage rotation things that we'll be doing in PvE for the most part. So let's jump straight into it as fast as we can. We are going to be using Staff. In particular, it's just so good at delivering its damage. However, there is one caveat for it, which you should bear in mind. Our main source of damage is going to be from the number 2 skill, Weakening Charge. The important thing is that you need to be landing all 3 hits each time we use it in our rotations. If that is somehow not possible, although I have not found that to be the case yet, it's just a case of learning hitboxes and things. It's not that difficult, you just need to practice a little bit. But, that being said, if for some reason you are unable to land all 3 hits of this skill, then Dagger will definitely begin to outpace Staff. So that's something you need to bear in mind. You just need to be learning this skill and its distance, its hitboxes and so on, and probably the hitboxes of each enemy that you face. However, we're probably going to be worrying more about bosses than anything else for that, so that's all gravy. Bosses aren't really difficult to learn hitboxes. So yeah, that's something to bear in mind. However, if you do land this rotation properly, it is insanely good AoE damage, let alone single target damage. So yeah, let's jump in. Starting with our equipment, and I don't think anyone's going to be surprised by this. We have full Berserker's armor and trinkets and weapons. We have Runes of the Scholar, as it always has been. It's probably just one of the best damage runes out there. Nothing really has changed here. And then we move on to our staff. I currently have a staff with a Sigil of Night and a Sigil of Force, and I have a second staff with Sigil of Air and Sigil of Force. You can guess which one is for what thing. We have a daytime staff and a nighttime staff. When it comes to raids and stuff, the night one won't matter at all, so Air and Force are going to be the way to go in those circumstances. I also have a bunch of other weapons for other situations, but I've found that I never really use them anymore. I have a pistol available that I can swap to an offhand for a smoke field, and I have a short bow on the other weapon swap that has a bloodless sigil, because I never really remove it for any reason, and a Sigil of Night for some extra damage I might put out. I might change that to Force so it can be a bit more versatile, but that's what I've put in there for now. So what I mean by that is that since I use staff for everything, damage-wise now, I will just equip one pistol in the offhand, blast a smoke field, and that'll be our team ready to go with all of their blast finishes and so on. So that's all I really use that for. Daggers I use for Condi builds, maybe. I do have Berserker ones here at the moment, in case if for some reason I'm particularly lazy on one day and I can't really land by weakening charges. But that's sort of all the real equipment I've got available in my inventory. If you're doing a lot of dungeons for some reason, or you have a particular vibe that you want to go really overkill in a fractal where slaying matters, then you can take a weapon with a slaying sigil instead, if night isn't working. But that's as far as you'll really go in terms of your inventory and adding extra weapons. For me, Night and Force and Air and Force are just the way to go. They're pretty basic, especially since I don't really do dungeons that much anymore, so I don't have an undead one, I don't have Outlaw for Corticus Mana or anything like that, that I find it pointless to carry those around anymore, so I only really have those. Trinkets, again, are Berserker. If you wanted to go overboard and infuse everything with Mighty Infusions for extra power, you could do that. However, they are so exorbitantly expensive that I really wouldn't bother. I will probably do that when Legendary Armor comes out, because that's pretty much the end goal there, and you can't really get better than that. But in terms of just Ascended Armor, I'm not going to bother. Plus, you never know, +7 power infusions might come out, since we've now got these +7 versatile simple ones, so I don't know. My advice is that if for some reason you have a crazy amount of money lying around, then go ahead, but otherwise I really wouldn't bother. It's just it's just so much money for so little gain, so I wouldn't go forward with that. But yeah, that's equipment. So let's get into our traits now, and we will pick Deadly Arts, Critical Strikes, and our new shiny Daredevil line. So let's quickly go over what we've got in our two baselines. We have Deadly Arts. Serpent's Touch is pretty basic, just deals some extra poison when you steal, which is not exactly a bad thing. Extra damage is always good in some way, shape or form, especially if it's poison, in case a raid boss needs a lot of poison. Maybe, who knows. And then we have the next two lines are actually completely optional, because Reveal Training is something we're not taking advantage of anymore. The Dagger Rotation would take advantage of this, but we won't on staff. So these two lines are just absolutely completely optional. One of my favorite things to do at the moment is to have a little burst of might when I'm solo. In a group this won't make a difference, but if you're solo you can take Trapper's Respite and Deadly Trapper, which will make your heal skill and any other trap give you 5 stacks of might and a stack of vulnerability and 5 stacks of vulnerability. So this means that if we were to use our new heal skill, Channel Vigor, we put this trap down, and if somebody triggers that we get 5 stacks, and if they trigger Shadow Trap, then Shadow Trap is actually 15 stacks of might because it gives you 10 by default. So that gives you a burst of 20 might to sort of go ahead and tear the face off whatever's attacking you at a certain point in time. Plus it's also 10 stacks of vuln base, which is very useful. So when solo, this is very handy, but in group situations there really isn't much point in doing that. So you can just take Mug for a damage boost and Panic Strike to help with the break bar, because Immobilize is a soft CC for that. So that's what you can do there. That's really useful. And then we have Exposed Weakness, which is of course just a 10% damage buff. I've also forgotten about Lotus Poison, which is weakening when we poison, but Staff has a lot of weakness anyway, so this really doesn't come into play anymore. And Executioner is a given, 20% damage and 50%, probably one of the best traits for damage out of all classes. I think 3 or 4 have this trait at the moment, and they all take it because it's just so good. So that's Deadly Arts. Moving on to Critical Strikes, we have Keen Observer, which will give us a 5% crit chance boost while we have our Scholar active, which is very handy indeed. We need all the crit chance we can get. Flawless Strike will give us 7% critical damage while above 90%, which is essentially almost just a 7% damage boost, because we get so close to 100, if not 100. But if you're in a very suboptimal situation, you could take Side Strike instead, which will help you get closer to 100. So it's kind of a switch up between those two, but Flawless Strike is usually the better way to go. Unrelenting Strikes will essentially give us almost half Fury uptime by itself. We'll get more than that in practice, but we'll get to that later. So this is a pretty damn good trait. I would use this. I would slot this line just for this, honestly. And then we have this next section. We can choose between Sundering Strikes or Practice Tolerance. And it seems that the vulnerability on crit really isn't a big thing to think about anymore. Everyone has such a crazy amount of vulnerability application, including us, without this trait at the moment, that this is really just a waste of a slot these days. 25 vulnerability is reached even in very suboptimal situations. So if for some reason your team is struggling to reach 25, I really doubt they will, but you can take this instead. But if not, you can take Practice Tolerance, which will give us at least sort of about 200 ferocity, which is over 10 critical damage, which is very, very, very good. So you're going to be wanting to take this one as much as you can. It's a serious boost to your own personal damage. Then we have Ferocious Strikes, which will be a 10% critical damage boost above the health threshold. According to the wiki, this is actually not a critical damage buff, it's just a damage modifier. It's just a 10% damage modifier. So that's actually far better than what it looks like on the tooltip, as far as the wiki tells us anyway. So that's quite cool. I thought it was worse than it actually is. More damage is always good, I guess. And then we have a choice of 2, but one very preferred one. We have No Quarter, which will give us Perma Fury and 250 extra ferocity, which is about 17% extra crit damage, which is a huge amount of damage. And that Perma Fury is just incredibly useful. In groups you're probably going to have Fury anyway, but this is just good for yourself as well. You can choose between this, or you can lose that crit damage and Fury Access for Invigorating Precision if for some reason you really need that extra healing. Like 1 Vault from Staff is enough to heal you to full. It's just that good. So I would consider this in a couple of situations where the damage input is just so crazy that you need to be keeping up with it and you haven't got a team that can keep up with it. Otherwise, no quarter is by far the preferred choice. That damage is just too good to ignore. So that's Critical Strikes. And now let's move on to the big shiny thing, which is our Daredevil. We have Physical Supremacy, which will increase our endurance threshold. We now have 3 dodges, which is very useful indeed. And we have access to the staff and physical skills, which I will get to later. We have Havoc Mastery in the first slot. We will be doing 7% more damage while in melee range, which is pretty much all the time. Just count this as a permanent damage boost. Driven Fortitude, which will heal us when we successfully evade on a 1-second cooldown. This is okay for a DPS build. Invigorating Precision will be the main healing you'll notice, but this is still okay. It's still a decent amount of healing over time, provided you're not getting completely bursted down by a boss by 1 hit. You shouldn't be, because we have so many evades, but it's still good nonetheless. Then we have Staff Master. This is essentially what replaces Reveal Training for us in terms of damage traits. So while wielding a staff, we're going to regain endurance for each initiative point we spend. So each time we Weakening Charge, we're going to get back 6 endurance, which is pretty damn good. And we're also going to do 10% more damage while our endurance isn't full. So we're going to be wanting our endurance to be less than full for all of our rotations, which is where the dodging will come in later. Then we have Endurance Thief, which will give back endurance when we successfully steal. This and the new heal will be very useful in maintaining our rotations, and I'll get to that later. So I immediately thought that this trait was underwhelming, but actually it's pretty damn useful, particularly for what we're going to be doing. So this is very cool indeed. It's a free dodge pretty much whenever you need it when you press F1, and that is just so handy for bosses that can one-shot you, particularly in PvP actually, when you're on the ropes and you've got your Sleight of Hand coming up, you've got Vigor, and you've got a free dodge immediately. So this is actually very good indeed. And now for our big final Grandmaster, we have Bounding Dodger, which will do damage to an area when we evade. It's essentially a mini vault. It hits almost as hard as a Cloak and Dagger in an AoE, and it's a leap finisher, and it will give us this little neat buff called Bounding Dodger, which is a 10% damage buff while for the next 4 seconds after a dodge roll. And we're going to be trying to keep this active for as much as possible. It's going to be the way to go for us. So this essentially defines the way that we play this build, and this is what makes it as good as Dagger. Well, better than Dagger if you can execute it correctly, but yeah. So this is pretty damn good. So those are our traits. In terms of nourishment, there are quite a few options to go with. I'd say the best option is probably Seaweed Salad, which gives you 10% more damage while moving. That's probably by far the most superior food in terms of extra damage output we can get. However, it's very expensive, and I know people don't really want to go for that if they don't have as much gold to rely on, especially with the release of the expansion. There's so much stuff to spend gold on now, and not really very many ways to get it back. So that's completely understandable if you don't want to go for the expensive foods. So Seaweed Salad is probably one of the most expensive ones. But there is a budget option in Cursed Shore. There is an 8% damage while moving. I'm not sure exactly what it's called. I think it's called Experimental Raiment. You can check that on the wiki. There's an event chain you need to do to get it. It's relatively cheap. Only lasts for 10 minutes, but you can just put the buff back on whenever you need it because it's so cheap. And I would consider that. Otherwise, you can also get bowls of sweet and spicy soup that are 100 power and 70 ferocity. Again, those are super expensive. Those were gold each. You could get truffle steak, which is 100 power and 70 precision instead, which is only 16 silver compared to a gold. Or you could get the steak and asparagus, which is 80 power and 60 precision. Those are a pretty good budget option at 7 silver each. So those are pretty damn good. In terms of the utility slot, slaying potions are the way to go for dungeons and fractals that require them, because of the certain types of enemies that are going to be everywhere. If you don't have a slaying one that can be optimal, then I've heard a lot of people say toxic sharpening stones or bountiful sharpening stones are the way to go, but for me, I don't see it. Because as a thief, we're not putting out a lot of boons apart from Fury for ourselves, which is permanent anyway. Our conditions don't really matter because we're not doing any condition damage, apart from the poison, which is completely negligible, and we're putting out so much weakness that we're overlapping our previous durations anyway. So those two types of sharpening stones make no difference to us whatsoever, and they are far more expensive than necessary for us. What you can just do instead is get a superior sharpening stone, because that gives you power equal to 6% of your toughness and 4% of your vitality, and with base 1000 of each, that is exactly 100 power, which is what toxic and bountiful sharpening stones would have given you. So this is actually just exactly as good as toxic or bountiful, but cheaper and easier to make. So I would just go for that if you can't use a potion. Another option is Scale Venom to inflict weakness and vulnerability, but again, we put out a lot of weakness and vulnerability anyway, so in our case, this really isn't a big deal. So definitely a superior sharpening stone or a slaying potion is the way to go. So that's nourishment. Let's get into some of the various utility skills and so on that we could be using in future. So previously I would have said that all our heals are pretty damn good. We have Withdraw, which is a free evade whenever we need it immediately. We have Hide in Shadows for a stealth to remove aggro and a pretty good heal. And we've got Signal of Malice, which is just great passive healing over time, although you should never activate it, because it's just a very pointless thing to do. However, Daredevil has introduced this new healing skill called Channeled Vigor, which heals on a 20-second cooldown for more than Hide in Shadows at base, and gives us 75 endurance, which is more than one free dodge. It's a dodge and a half. So the only time you would ever benefit from Withdraw is if there's a lot of Immobilize, Chill, Cripple, or whatever. There's less healing on it. It's almost the same cooldown. So, like, the biggest benefit really is the immediate evade. If you don't need that immediate evade, then what's the point? Channel Vigor is just by far better. And Signal of Malice, if you get smashed by one hit of a boss and your health is down to super low, Channel Vigor is going to be far more useful to get it back up very quickly than Signal of Malice, in my opinion. So, like, I have never found a use for Signal of Malice in this new content, and I found it far more useful than the Signet in Fractals as well. I would say get used to trying to play with this, because it's just so powerful. I can't believe how powerful it is. It's so good. So I would definitely try this. And in terms of our utility slots, we have the trap I was talking about, Shadow Trap, which is good for the might stacks. But that's alright, I guess. The slot that the Shadow Trap is in at the moment is filler, essentially, because these two, Assassin Signet and Signet of Agility, they are the way to go. Those DPS signets are very powerful. However, these two can be malleable, these two slots. The Signet of Agility I would keep on at all times, because giving your team 2 dodges whenever they need them on an emergency is just so damn powerful, and that precision is very good to keep your crit chance up. If you really needed 2 utilities for something, I would swap out Assassin Signet instead. So in terms of the new skills that we've been granted, we have Fist Flurry, which is very good filler damage. It's more than a backstab and a Cloak and Dagger combined if you use both the skills, Fist Flurry and Palm Strike, and it's a 2-second stun. So it does a huge amount of damage to a break bar while doing an impressive amount of damage. We also have Distracting Daggers, which is good for ranged breaking, but the awkward internal cooldown between the daggers means that I don't really find myself using it that often. An alternative for breaking is Bandit's Defense, and it's also a cool block and short cooldown stun breaker. So whenever a boss attacks you and they have a break bar available, you could use this to block the attack and retaliate with a 2-second knockdown, which will also smash up their break bar. So there are quite a few varied options of using the skill offensively or defensively. I've had more luck with Fist Flurry personally, just because it's a nice amount of damage as well. But you can use either, and that block and Sunbreak is just too good to ignore in the grand scheme of things. Just Impairing Daggers is good to immobilize an ad that you need to immobilize or something, but I haven't really found much use for it. So those are the new physicals in the utility slot, and they are, for the most part, pretty good, especially for the crowd control potential. And then we have the Elite, the new one, Impact Strike. This is probably a more preferable option to Basilisk Venom for crowd control, in my opinion. Basilisk Venom is 2 1-second stuns, but Impact Strike is a 2-second daze followed by a launch, and the launch does an enormous amount of damage to a break bar. Using Fist Flurry or Bandit's Defense plus Impact Strike into Uppercut is pretty much enough to almost take down an entire break bar yourself instantly. The only time I would ever use Basilisk Venom now for CC is if I was using a Venom Share build, and I might make a video on that another time, but for now I would say stick with Impact Strike. That extra CC is just incredibly useful in Fractals and probably in the new raids to shut down break bars very, very effectively. So that's our utility bar covered, really. One thing I forgot to touch on, by the way, is our staff skills. So I just want to touch on those before we actually start the rotation. So we have the auto attack chain, which is pretty strong. It's a tiny bit slower than Dagger. It's only about 7 milliseconds slower than Dagger in total, so it's not a big deal at all. It's negligible in terms of speed difference, but it does hit a lot harder. It hits almost as hard as Sword, not quite as hard as Sword, but close to, and it does 4 stacks of vulnerability when the chain is complete, while also reflecting missiles and being a well finisher. So if an Elementalist has a fire field down, you could be getting burning ticks while you're doing your auto chain, and a bunch of other things as well. So that's incredibly useful. You might find that it's weird for the reflect to be on the 3rd hit and therefore not being able to access it very well. However, you will find it saves you quite a bit. There have been multiple situations while playing the expansion where something has been firing a projectile at me and I've realized that I'm going to have the skill available, so I don't dodge it and I just let the chain play through and I have that reflect ready to go and it saves me. It's more useful than you think. Just keep onto it and bear it in mind when you're fighting random creatures out there. Then we have skill 2, Weakening Charge, like I've already gone over a little bit. It hits so hard. It hits it's harder than a 25% Heartseeker on the daggers. And you're going to be using this consistently in our damage rotation from 100% health. So that is such an insane amount of punishment if you can land it correctly. That's the key, like I was talking about. So this is very good. And it also applies weakness, which means that it's incredibly good for adds that have a lot of attacks very frequently, so they're going to bypass blinds. So in general, this is just very good. And it's also another world finisher, so we can again put down more burns or more confusion from time warp or whatever the case may be. So in general, this is just very good. And then we have Debilitating Arc. It's a pretty good amount of damage, and we will cripple things, which is okay for soft CC, I guess, but it also removes Immobilize, which comes in handy in Heart of Thorns, particularly with lots of immobilizing things out there. The big thing really is just that it evades, and if you need that emergency evade for something, if you're out of endurance and other evade frames, then this will come in handy. A thing to bear in mind is that when you use the skill, the evade is immediate. It's not when the staff is hitting something, it just happens as soon as you press the skill. So that is a very good on-demand evade, rather than something like the old Death Blossom where you'd start the skill but not be evading, and then be evading for a fraction of a second, which was terrible. They fixed that now, but it's not like how that used to be, at least. So this is a very reliable evade frame to take advantage of when you need it. So just keep that in mind. And then we have Dust Strike, which is a pretty good blind. It's not a blind field, it's not going to save your lives all the time like Black Powder used to, but it's good in an emergency where you've dodged out and something is about to wipe out your team, and you can just quickly smash them in the face with the blind from a distance and shut them down. I found that in general blinds aren't really an issue when we have Cliff of Storm's Ellies running around, and we also have Smokescreen to blind in a stack and so on. In general, I haven't really found the need for Black Powder anymore. It just seems to be a little bit outdated to rely on that, especially considering that Sword only hits 3 targets, where we can hit 5 with our regular attacks on staff. So in general, I would say that this is actually pretty good. It's not amazing. It's not Black Powder tier, but it's handy sometimes, and I wouldn't ignore it. And then we have Vault. This is a very good way to keep putting out damage while you need to evade things. It does such a huge amount of damage in an AoE that I've pretty much been just spamming it in Heart of Thorns, in the open world at least. when we've got pocket raptors and stuff running around everywhere, you just press this and they all die pretty much instantly, and you completely evade their initial attacks. This has been a very handy skill indeed, and I would say it's probably more useful as an AoE clearer than weakening charges, particularly in various fractals. Like the volcanic fractal, you have the lava elementals at the end that go everywhere and swarm you. You can use Volt to just immediately wipe out 4 or 5 of them at once. And yeah, it's a very good clearing tool, it's a very good evasive tool, and it's not quite as good a damage tool, DPS-wise, as weakening charges. It's worse than landing daggers, but it's still good, and I would use it quite often if I need that evade frame, simply because putting out damage at the same time is always good. So overall, I'm very happy with the skill set. I could do with a change to the strike, maybe a point-blank AoE rather than a line or something, but for the most part, I'm very happy with all of it. And I think it's probably the best PvE skill set we have available at the moment by a large margin. I feel like daggers are almost outdated at this point, unless you can't land all 3 hits of weakening charge, like I said, in which case the old dagger DPS with bounding dodger is going to be more beneficial in a boss. Anyway, so yeah, let's go on to the rotation. So your DPS rotation is going to be dodge roll, weakening charge twice, ensuring that it hits 3 times both ways, which may require a little bit of positioning, and then 1 auto chain, which means staff strike, staff bash, and all 4 hits of punishing strikes. And once the 4th hit of punishing strikes lands, you want to immediately repeat, so dodge roll and 2 weakening charges and auto chain, and just do that over and over and over as fast as you can. If you are very efficient with this, then you will see your initiative start to run out over the next minute or so. Although, being realistic here, raid bosses and such aren't going to be just a golem standing still, so you're not going to be doing this over and over for a whole minute. You're going to spend at least 2 or 3 seconds avoiding something, or doing a raid mechanic, or moving somewhere to do something important. So you're not going to be literally doing this over and over forever. It's just not realistic to think that way. So in those circumstances, you are never going to have initiative problems. But if there is a very long DPS phase of some kind, and you are able to rotate this over and over for like over a minute or so, then you will see your initiative start to deplete. And when that happens, there is a solution in one of your utilities. If you do run low, let's say 4 or 3 initiative, so you can't complete 2 weakening strikes in a single rotation, instead of using weakening charge, you can use Fist Flurry and Palm Strike. Fist Flurry and Palm Strike is equivalent to about 98 or 99% of 2 weakening charges, and it doesn't use initiative. So it will save you a little bit of time to get your initiative back up to par, and you won't lose pretty much any DPS in the process. So that's an option, but like I said, it's just not realistic to think you'll run out because you actually have to do things, unlike what you see here. And even a couple of seconds of not doing this rotation will mean you have enough initiative to repeat the whole process again. So you really shouldn't have any issues whatsoever with your resources while doing this. And that is it for today, guys. I hope you enjoy this build. I have found it the absolute most fun and the most rewarding I've had in any PvE on Thief since launch, actually. And really, you just need to bear in mind the incredible strengths of this. Like, first of all, being the damage, second being the immense amount of weakness we're putting out to ads, and the biggest thing for me at the moment is the incredible amount of CC, especially from things like Fist Flurry and Reflexive Strike, and Impact Strike to Uppercut, the incredible increase in self-survivability with Endurance on Heal, Endurance on Steel, Evasive Frames on the weapon set itself. In general, I am very pleased with it, and have found it the absolute best thing ever for PvE, and I hope you guys find the same thing as well. So get to learning those weakening charge rotations, and have fun, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.